That's great. And I wanted to get back to this issue around mobility, right, that Bradley had raised earlier, as it relates, so some of this is that having these universal benefits buffers people, right? It protects people against risk or adverse life events, and that we know from a lot of the other research that these are the things that then could lead to downward mobility or get in the way or be obstacles to people moving from one neighborhood to another when they experience job loss or health issues, and things like that. But when we talk about mobility, there's as we mentioned, decades of research in sociology around persistence in intergenerational, the lack of intergenerational mobility, several years of research now in economics about this, right, that has put this on the table. And often we think about the persistence of class status at the lower levels, right, that people who are born into the lowest 20% are likely to stay in the lowest 20%, people are likely to stay in their position. And at the top as well, right? So it's the flip side of inequality, what's going on at the top, people at the top tend to stay at the top, right? But I think there's a sense, at least culturally or socially, even among the folks in the top 20%, that there's like an anxiety, right? That they may not be holding on to their position. And this is something I think that Richard Reeves develops in this idea around dream hoarding, right? And so is that the flip side of the myth of mobility in America, right? That we may believe in the possibilities of upward mobility, but the data doesn't seem to really bear that out. And at the same time, if we believe that there's a smooth process for upward mobility, then there should be a process, there should be a possibility of downward mobility, right? And that may not be true. That's not exactly true empirically, right? That people who are at the top tend to stay at the top. But is it that the folks in that top 20% think because there's a mobility in America that their kids may actually fall down dramatically and that they are acting out of anxiety to protect their status?
Well, so there's a lot there, and part of what I want to touch on would be, it's not costless for upper income families to maintain the status of their children, and I would even argue that there's some positive spillovers for the sorts of policy interventions along the domains of well-funded educational interventions, tackling the affordable housing challenge. And I want to stay there for a second. Many, upper income families, middle income families are going to find their household budgets strained quite a bit to essentially give their children a positive chance at upward mobility. So you're going to spend more of your household's budget to be in that more expensive neighborhood that gets them access to the higher quality schools that you believe might get them access to higher quality colleges and universities. And so in essence, if you had a more even and equitable distribution of quality, which I would argue costs money and takes revenue, for example, you are going to have some spillovers, not just for poor families and low-income families. I think a challenge, however, is that you were talking about the unemployment statistics. They're salient, and this is where it does go way beyond the domain of my training in economics to think about political science. Folks glom on to salience. The unemployment rate's very clear, but there's economic insecurity that's occurring with household budgets, with health shocks, low savings, a lack of emergency savings. And so when you think about that, this is certainly hitting our low-income families hard, but if you were to look up the income distribution, many families with even high income flows, if that income were cut off, they don't have much to weather the storm.
So that sense of insecurity is real.
I think so.
Yeah. That's great. And so you mentioned something that stood out to us really briefly around the costs of some of the necessary public or social investments, right? Or there'll be costs to bear, right? And I wanted to direct this to Tom over there, that there's this idea or there's a sort of discourse, right, that we tend to look for solutions that are win-win solutions, right, where everybody benefits, we can fix inequality and lift all boats, and it's good for everybody. Are we getting to a point now in terms of the magnitude of inequality where the win-win solutions are no longer tenable? Is there an element of it that is zero sum? Just mathematically, if you're decreasing inequality to raise people up at the bottom, you're also pulling people who are at the top closer to people at the bottom, right? So is there Is that a necessary part of it, or are we still looking for win-win solutions?
I mean, I think of that as a little bit of the ice cream versus spinach issue. Like in the long run, everybody wins from a more equitable society, from a more racially inclusive society, from a more climate sustainable society. There's no question about it. Does it feel that way today? If someone told me to eat spinach, but I had ice cream, a box of donuts in front of me, like the donuts taste better, right? So I think that it is true that there is. In the same way, you're not going to get in shape without going on a little bit of a diet and starting to exercise, but you're going to be happier where you get in the end. I would say those people, even who have the concentration of power and wealth right now, are better off. But I don't think we're going to convince them of that in the in the short term, because spinach isn't very or kale's even worse. So I think that am I allowed to say that in this town? I don't even know. So I think that we shouldn't try to think we can reason everyone there. I mean, Daniel Markovitz's work right now on inequality and meritocracy talks about the fact that this huge separation of the top 10% or 1% or however you count it. It's not like their kids are winning. I mean, if you look at anxiety levels, if you look at depression levels, suicide levels, like the hyper intensity of that, you'd rather be on the high end of it than the low end of it. We're not trying to create equivalence there. But people are freaked out across this spectrum right now. On sustainability, obviously we only have one planet to work with. But I do think that this is a town, one side of this town gets very freaked out about the idea of anyone losing, particularly if those people are donors. It was interesting when we were looking at every single person in 08 had run on, extending the Bush tax cuts below $250,000 and retiring above. And I can't tell you how many caucus meetings I was in where everyone was like, well, no, but $250,000 is middle class in my district. And so I did the research, and the richest district was Connecticut 5 at the time. I think it was Himes, maybe in Murphy then, I don't even remember. And that was the 89th percentile in that district, right? But if you look at it being middle class for the people that show up to campaign events, who show up at fundraising, who are in people's neighborhoods, it is very middle class. And it's not like those people were doing great at that point relative to where they were. So I think this notion of whether taking some of that revenue and investing it in a Green New Deal type, 5 to 10 year build, investing it in a living wage campaign, and keeping a public option in there are people that would have lost short term. Insurance companies would have lost and elsewhere. Other people would have won. Would we be better off as a society on the other end? So I think the conservative side is very willing to impose short-term losses for what they believe builds power, maybe gets to a better world. Never know. But I think, yes, sometimes there are things that in the short term will have trade-offs to get us to a better place. And that's part of what leadership is about. I mean, the most dramatic version of this that we're not asking people to do is, you do not order a D-Day invasion if you are not willing to say some people are going to pay the ultimate price. Here, we're not asking people to send people to die. We're just saying you might have to ask some donors to pay a slightly higher marginal tax rate in order for kids across America to have an opportunity to succeed in their education. So yes, I think ultimately we do rise or fall together as a country. We rise or fall together as a common humanity. But that does not mean that everyone's going to experience that in exactly the same way at every moment.
Yeah. Well, and if I can jump in just to build on the point that Tom made earlier about power building, these things are related, right? And at some level, there are beginning to be signs that at least some folks in the corporate sector recognize that maybe it's unsustainable for the gap to be as huge as it is, and hopefully that is motivated by all of the right things, but it's possible that some of it is motivated by the visions of people ultimately coming at them with the pitchforks and the torches. Mm-hmm. And what that says to me is some pitchforks and torches might not be such a bad thing. That making sure that we are engaging thoughtfully in creating the capacity for people, again, to lift up their own situations effectively and contribute to this conversation, feels like this is a tremendously important moment for that. And so I think it's we have to be looking at the full spectrum of what it takes to get good policy passed and implemented by a government. Involves the data that leads to the right ideas. It involves engaging communities, and it involves being deliberate about understanding where there are opportunities to build power and making sure we're being deliberate about that.
Yeah, great. Pitchforks may not be such a bad thing. So there's an emoji for a pitchfork, I think, on your phone when you tweet that out and attribute that to Cecilia. So I did want to come back to Cecilia in terms of the context, the policy context or the political context, especially from your background at around domestic policy in the White House, from that vantage point. Right now we have we mentioned we're in the longest economic expansion in history, right? Very low unemployment rates, tight labor markets. We know what we expect. I mean, Heather mentioned that the standard rules of economics don't seem to apply in the context of extreme inequality, but market economies typically have ups and downs, right? So we've gone on the longest ride up that we've seen in history. It's likely that it'll come down at some point. It's impossible to predict when, but we can believe that it's inevitably going to happen at some point. So we're not very good about thinking in the future about different contexts that are so different than where we're at today. What are the politics of structural change or structural reforms look like in a context of an economic downturn when people are losing their jobs? Do people become more? Is the focus then on more immediate priorities? Do people lose their appetite for the ideas of structural change, or does it go in the other direction?
Well, I mean, my experience in government, right? We walked in 2009 in the middle of the epic downturn, right? Shedding 700, 800,000 jobs a month. So yeah, that absolutely shaped what happened in the Obama transition and what happened certainly in the first years of the Obama administration. And at some level, it affected the thinking throughout all 8 years. In that, look, in part, just the governing imperative if things are going this way is that you have to take steps because this affects people's lives. You have to take steps to level the ship, to right the ship, and to move forward. And because Washington is not so capable of doing multiple things at a time, other things end up having to fall off the agenda. And so that's certainly the way I experienced it. I would argue that wasn't just a matter of, a president taking action because of the politics of the issue. There was also, these were people's lives, people's jobs, people's livelihoods, people's homes. But it did make it really, really difficult to, have the conversation that we wanted to have about climate in the first term. And we weren't able to have the conversation that we wanted to have about climate until the second term, right? Until people were starting to feel more confident about their economic circumstances. So I do think it is important to get our heads around now what governing might look like in general, because what it takes to campaign is different from what it takes to govern, and so I think that's a good thing to do no matter what, but to get our heads around the possibility that, if we are wildly successful, God willing, and there is a new administration soon, that we may be governing in the context of economic constraint. We know that we would be governing at a time of kind of extraordinary deficits, and we know the result of incredible financial irresponsibility, among many, many other irresponsible things by this administration. And, I've learned that for all your ambition, governing is constrained by sort of where people are. That affects where the Congress is. And so it's important to think that through, and I think it would be incredibly useful to game that out early rather than in the moment.
Yeah, that's great. So in the last few moments that we have, wanted to turn to some questions that we're getting from the audience here. And one, I think this is a great question that we could pose it to the whole panel. So the question is, what are the best policies or programs that you've seen that improve economic mobility over the short term? Because politicians generally think over shorter term horizons. And then expanding that a little bit, if you look out there, especially at the state and local levels, what are the most interesting or exciting policies, programs, ideas that you've seen out there, things that may be pushing the envelope, or things that you would suggest to the audience to be keeping an eye out for? So don't say EITC, right? So stuff that people may not already know about, stuff that's happening out in the hinterlands. So
I think universal family care is a very exciting movement. I think that, if we can actually look at child care with long-term care, with, the kinds of all the care that we need along the continuum of life, and then package that in a way where it's most effective and efficient, that we will have done a very good service for the entire nation. In terms of programs that I'm excited about, get this, Social Security. It does what it was supposed to do. It does what it was designed to do. It is effective. It is efficient. It has created, the lowest poverty rates among seniors in the history of the country. And so, when you look at how to design policy, I think that it still represents one that is a successful model. And it's an economic stabilizer. In downturns, it's still providing the stimulus that local economies need across the country.
Oh, yeah, it's essential.
difficult and politically, but simple, I think, resources, income and near cash matter quite a bit. We know it from the cross-disciplinary research, whether it's food stamps, whether it's the benefits for housing security via programs like EITC and TANF. But TANF reform is going to be important. If I were going to kind of talk about something on the table that maybe is less discussed, it's sort of in the domain of skills training. A lot of interesting Obama-era social innovation fund programs at the local level that we're doing kind of combinations of community college training, connecting with employers at the local level so that there's actually a job more or less guaranteed at the end of it, and providing some on-site supportive services for the actual workers. And I think academics can do a better job of paying attention to how popular those programs are, even oversubscribed. High-quality jobs can move you up the economic ladder.
Yeah, that there being there's a good job at the end of those.
That's right.
programs, Yeah.
That's right.
Cecilia,
So I agree completely with Maya on universal family care, but I'm going to give an unconventional answer since she gave the answer that I would have given. Because immigration reform does not come up in these kinds of spaces, in these kinds of circles, and it is in fact a strategy for economic growth as well as economic mobility, and we don't think of it that way, except that it is. And I think it would make a big difference if we began to think about it in these terms, because it's true.
Tom, last word.
So I mentioned antitrust earlier, which is getting a fair amount of discussion, but I think the flip side of that is in part that, like, if you take it out of tech and you look at the utilities, there's actually an enormous economy of scale right now for relocalizing energy production along with food and beverage production, including a lot of food that can be higher protein, lower fat in school lunches and not shipped in from mega ag. So, like, I sometimes joke that relocalizing production isn't just for survivalists and hipsters anymore. Like, it's actually an enormous potential in the economy that keeps jobs local to home and jobs that may not be coding jobs because some people really like to produce. So I think when we think about antitrust, we know what we're against, which is we want to break up these big companies, some of us do. But it's also about what it reopens, which is the idea of having sovereignty in the community to think about how you design that community, how you get some of these systems to go together, and they're real sustainable living wage jobs. I think this can obviously be in the context of a Green New Deal as well. So I think we need to reimagine what some of these what it means to do community level or regional level development. And obviously if you change some of the economic incentives, if you change some of the corporate incentives, that price point shifts very dramatically to the idea of saying, well, of course you would produce some of that within a 60-mile radius of where people are consuming it.
Yeah, great, thanks. So 45 minutes, that's structural change.
Please welcome Nina Banks, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University.